"That name was never mine," said a woman who discovered her entire identity was a lie, and that she was actually a child who had gone missing over 20 years ago. It all started with a clerical error and ended with a reunion no one ever expected. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Linda Grant woke up to the blaring of her alarm clock at exactly 6:15, the same way she had for the past 5 years since moving out of the Winters Ranch. She silenced it with a practiced motion and stared at the ceiling of her modest apartment in Henderson, Nevada, for exactly 2 minutes before getting up. Routine was her anchor. Shower for 7 minutes, coffee brewing while she dressed, toast with peanut butter eaten at the small kitchen table while reading the news on her tablet. Her morning ritual never varied, and that was exactly how she liked it. The October sun was already warming the desert landscape as she gathered her things for work. Her bag was packed the night before, lunch in a reusable container, water bottle filled, keys and ID badge in the side pocket. At 29, Linda had created a life of careful routine and measured interactions. She preferred books to people and found peace in the vast, empty desert that surrounded the city. Her apartment walls were sparsely decorated, save for a collection of pressed wildflowers and a single red mitten she'd found in a box of childhood keepsakes. She couldn't remember where it came from, but something had compelled her to display it on her bookshelf. The drive to Desert Plains Community College took exactly 20 minutes in normal traffic. Linda had worked in the administrative office for 5 years, processing student applications and managing department schedules. Her colleagues described her as efficient but reserved, someone who smiled politely but rarely laughed. She declined invitations to happy hours with gracious excuses that never varied. Dr. Eleanor Patel, the psychology professor who occasionally brought Linda coffee, once remarked that she had the most carefully constructed boundaries she'd ever seen. Not hostile, but impenetrable, as if protecting something fragile within. "Morning, Linda," said Marcus, the new intern at the front desk, as she badged into the building. "Beautiful day, right?" "Yes, it is," she replied, with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She continued to her desk without breaking stride, setting down her bag and turning on her computer in the same sequence she followed every day. The familiarity was comforting. At home, Linda maintained meticulous records of her life, journals filled with observations rather than emotions, photographs carefully labeled and dated, receipts organized by month and year. This documentation habit had begun after finding inconsistencies in the few childhood mementos the Winters had kept. A school certificate with a name partially erased, photographs that seemed to start abruptly at age 10 with no baby pictures, a vaccination record with unexplained gaps. These discrepancies bothered her in ways she couldn't articulate, like splinters under her skin that she'd learned to live with but never removed. That evening, Linda checked her calendar and noted her DMV appointment scheduled for the following day, October 12th. The date always carried a strange weight for her. Each year, she acknowledged it with a small ritual, lighting a candle and sitting quietly by her window, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. She had no idea why the date felt significant, only that it did. This year would be different, though she didn't know it yet. A new digital system was cross-referencing records, and Marcus Wong, who worked part-time at the DMV to support his college studies, was about to notice an anomaly that would shatter Linda's carefully constructed life and reveal a truth she'd never known. She wasn't Linda Grant at all. Marcus Wong rubbed his tired eyes and took another sip of his energy drink. 3 months into his internship at the Nevada Department of Motor Vehicles, he was still adjusting to the mind-numbing monotony of checking digital records. The department had recently converted decades of paper files into a new database, and part of Marcus's job was to verify the accuracy of the conversion. "Only 2 more hours," he muttered to himself, clicking to the next file. Linda Grant, a standard Nevada driver's license issued 6 years ago, renewed once. Marcus was about to move on when something caught his eye. The Social Security number on her original application didn't match the one on her birth certificate. Probably just a typo during the digital conversion, but protocol required him to flag any discrepancy. "Hey Deb, can you take a look at this?" He called to his supervisor, a middle-aged woman with 20 years of DMV experience. "The SSN doesn't match the birth certificate." Deborah frowned as she looked over his shoulder. "Flag it and forward it to verification." Probably nothing, but you never know. 2 days later, Special Agent Carla Delgado opened the email from the Nevada DMV with mild interest. After 15 years with the FBI's Missing Persons Unit, most potential leads turned into dead ends. Identity theft cases were common enough, usually involving credit fraud or immigration issues. She ran the flagged Social Security number through the national database, expecting to find a duplicate usage. The system returned a match that made her sit up straight. The number had been dormant for nearly 20 years, last used for a tax dependency claim in 1995 by Tom and Janet Mitchell of Walden, Maine, for their daughter, Sarah. Delgado's heart began to race as she pulled up the case file. Sarah Mitchell, 9 years old, disappeared on October 12, 1995, while walking to school. Never recovered. With practiced efficiency, Delgado ran the DMV photo through the age progression software, comparing it to the last known image of Sarah Mitchell. The resemblance was striking enough to warrant further investigation. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Rita, it's Carla. I need your help with a potential recovery. Long-term case, adult now." Rita Hang had spent 23 years as a social worker specializing in child trafficking and abduction cases. She reviewed Linda Grant's sparse public records, minimal social media presence, steady employment at the same community college, a clean criminal record, and before that, nothing but homeschool records signed by Martha Winter. The property records for the Winter Ranch revealed 3 previous addresses across 3 different states, each residence lasting approximately 4 to 5 years. "Classic isolation pattern," Rita told Delgado over coffee the next morning. No school records, no medical visits during her supposed childhood. The Winters kept moving every few years, probably whenever they felt someone might ask questions. "Do you think she knows?" Delgado asked. Rita considered the question. Hard to say. Some children completely repress these memories, especially if the abduction happened at a young age. Others have fragments, but can't piece them together. Either way, we need to approach this carefully. If she is Sarah Mitchell, this will upend her entire sense of self. Linda arrived at the DMV at precisely 2:15, 15 minutes before her scheduled appointment. She preferred to be early for everything. The office was unusually quiet, and she noticed the woman at the counter watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Instead of being called to a regular service window, she was directed to a small conference room where 2 women waited, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit and a softer-looking Asian woman with kind eyes. "Miss Grant, I'm Agent Delgado with the FBI, and this is Rita Hang from Child Protection Services," the woman in the suit said. "We'd like to ask you some questions about your identification documents." Linda's first thought was that there had been some mistake with her paperwork, perhaps an issue with the Winters estate that she'd recently settled. Her second thought, as Agent Delgado gently explained that her Social Security number belonged to a girl who had disappeared from Maine 20 years earlier, was that the ground beneath her carefully constructed life had just fallen away completely. "This is a missing person flyer from 1995, Delgado said, sliding a document across the table. The girl's name was Sarah Mitchell. Linda stared at the school photo of a 9-year-old girl with neat brown braids and a blue cardigan. When Delgado placed an age progression image beside it, Linda felt a strange disconnection, like looking at a familiar stranger. "We're not making accusations," Rita said gently. "But we would like your permission for a DNA test to rule this out." Linda nodded mechanically, extending her arm for the cheek swab, while her mind raced through memories that suddenly seemed like props on a stage rather than genuine reflections of her life. "The results are conclusive," Agent Delgado said, her voice gentle but firm. "The DNA comparison shows you are Sarah Mitchell, with 99.9997% certainty. Linda, or Sarah, as she now knew herself to be, sat motionless in the same small conference room at the local FBI field office. A box of tissues sat untouched on the table beside a paper cup of water she couldn't bring herself to drink. The science was irrefutable, but the reality was incomprehensible. "The Winters," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "They weren't my guardians." "No," Rita confirmed. "Based on our investigation, they abducted you and created a false identity." The words hung in the air like smoke. Every story the Winters had told her about her origins had been fabricated. The car accident that supposedly killed her parents, the distant relatives who didn't want her, the isolated homeschooling to protect her from a world they claimed was dangerous and corrupt, all lies designed to keep her from discovering the truth. "Your biological family has been notified," Agent Delgado continued. "The Mitchells are still in Maine. They're eager to reconnect with you, but everyone understands this is overwhelming." Linda Sarah stared at her hands, trying to reconcile the person she believed herself to be with this new revelation. "Do I have to meet them?" she asked. "No," Rita said firmly. "Everything happens at your pace. We can start with photos, letters, maybe video calls when you're ready. There's no rush." 2,000 miles away in Walden, Maine, Janet Mitchell collapsed into a kitchen chair when she received the call from Agent Delgado. 20 years of grief had calcified around the loss of her youngest child, hardening into a resignation that Sarah was gone forever. The family had held a memorial service on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, planting a white pine in the town square with a small bronze plaque bearing her name. "Tom," she called out, her voice breaking. Her husband appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the tone. "They found her. They found Sarah." Tom Mitchell's face went blank with shock. "Found her? Alive?" Janet nodded, tears streaming down her face. "In Nevada. She's 29 now. She doesn't remember us. The people who took her changed her name to Linda." Tom sank into the chair beside his wife, weeping openly for the first time since the early days of the search. Their son, Jason, now 32 with a family of his own, responded with cautious disbelief when they called him with the news. After years of false leads and disappointments, hope had become a dangerous emotion for the Mitchell family. Rita Hang had seen many reunifications throughout her career, but none after such a prolonged separation with no memory of the original family. She counseled both sides about the complex emotions ahead, the Mitchells' excitement tempered by the reality that Sarah was now Linda, a grown woman with no recollection of them, and Linda's shock and disorientation as she tried to reconcile her established identity with this new revelation. "This isn't just a happy ending," she told both parties separately. "It's the beginning of a complicated journey toward a new kind of relationship." In her apartment that night, Linda emptied a box of childhood possessions onto her bed. A small collection of children's books with Linda written in clumsy handwriting that didn't match her adult script. School assignments dated from when she would have been 10 or 11, but nothing earlier. A stuffed rabbit with one ear more worn than the other, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, the single red mitten that had always drawn her attention without explanation. She held it now, turning it over in her hands, wondering if its match was somewhere in an attic in Maine, saved by a mother she couldn't remember. For the first time since the revelation, she allowed herself to cry, not for the life she'd lost as a child, which remained a blank, but for the bewildering task of becoming someone she'd never known herself to be. 3 days later, a package arrived from the Mitchells. Linda opened it slowly, both dreading and craving its contents. Inside were recent photos of Janet, Tom, and Jason, along with a letter from each of them. They were careful and gentle in their introduction, making no demands or assumptions. At the bottom of the box was a family portrait from the summer before Sarah's disappearance. A smiling 9-year-old with her parents and 12-year-old brother at a lakeside picnic. What struck Linda most, however, was a small Ziploc bag containing the second red mitten, preserved for 20 years in a cedar chest. When she placed it beside its match from her own collection, they were identical. The same shade of crimson, the same snowflake pattern around the wrist, the same tiny white thread pulled loose on the thumb. This physical evidence of her severed life affected her more deeply than the DNA results or photographs. That night, she slept with both mittens clutched in her hand and dreamed of snow falling on pine trees and a woman's voice singing a melody that seemed hauntingly familiar. Linda changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple blue blouse for the video call. She cleaned her already spotless apartment, arranged and rearranged the pillows on her couch, and checked the lighting from every angle. The nervous energy was unlike her usual methodical calm, but nothing about this situation was usual. "Remember, this is just an introduction," Rita said, sitting beside her on the couch with her laptop open. "You control how fast this goes." Linda nodded, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Rita established the connection, and suddenly there they were, 3 strangers who shared her DNA, gathered around a kitchen table in Maine. Janet Mitchell appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that matched Linda's own. Her husband Tom had a beard peppered with gray and glasses that couldn't hide the emotion in his gaze. They both leaned toward the screen as if trying to cross the digital divide. "Hello, Sarah," Janet said softly, then quickly corrected herself. "I'm sorry, Linda." "Hi," Linda replied, the single syllable catching in her throat. An awkward silence followed until Tom pulled out a small notebook. "I made a list of things we could talk about," he said with an apologetic smile, "in case we got stuck." The simple admission broke the tension slightly. Tom began describing Walden, the small coastal Maine town where they lived. He showed pictures of the bookstore he now ran, the changing fall colors, and the town square. "That's the memorial tree," he said, his voice catching slightly as he held up his phone to show a tall white pine. "It's a lot bigger now, of course. We planted it for you, for Sarah, on the 10th anniversary," Janet explained. "I guess we'll need to change the plaque now." Halfway through the call, a man in his early 30s appeared behind Tom and Janet. "Is that her?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Jason," Linda whispered, recognizing her brother from the photo she'd received. Jason's resemblance to Linda was striking, the same high cheekbones and straight nose. He was followed by a young girl who peered curiously at the screen. "Are you really my aunt?" the child asked, with the directness only 7-year-olds possess. The simple question cut through the careful adult conversation. "I guess I am," Linda answered, smiling genuinely for the first time. After the call ended, Linda lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, emotionally exhausted, yet oddly energized. The Mitchells had been careful not to overwhelm her with expectations or direct questions about her life with the Winters. Instead, they focused on establishing a connection in the present, treating her simultaneously as the daughter they had lost and the woman she had become. Janet had shown her a small music box that played a lullaby she used to sing to Sarah, and even through the video call's tinny audio, Linda had felt an inexplicable tightening in her chest at the melody. It matched the song from her dream after receiving the mittens, a coincidence too specific to dismiss. These small resonances, the mittens, the melody, the familiar shape of Janet's eyes and Jason's nose, were beginning to create a constellation of connection to a past she couldn't consciously recall. "How are you feeling?" Rita asked during their post-call discussion. Linda considered the question carefully. "Like I'm reading a book about someone else's life, but occasionally recognizing something that belongs to me." Rita nodded, That makes sense. Your hippocampus, which stores biographical memories, was still developing when you were taken. But your amygdala, which processes emotional responses and sensory memories like music, tastes, and smells, was already quite functional. That's why the lullaby or the mittens might trigger feelings of familiarity without specific memories. Linda found comfort in this scientific explanation for her confusing emotional responses. It meant that somewhere within her, Sarah still existed, not just as a DNA profile, but as accumulated experiences that had shaped who she had become. In the weeks that followed, the video calls became more frequent. Linda began to research Maine independently, looking up images of Walden and reading about New England autumns. She found herself drawn to pictures of forests and coastal towns, saving them to a folder on her computer without fully understanding why. One evening, she ordered takeout from a seafood restaurant, something she rarely did, and discovered an unexpected preference for lobster rolls, a food she couldn't remember ever trying before. Small discoveries like this both unsettled and fascinated her, like archaeological evidence of a person she had been. She started a journal specifically to document these moments, titled Sarah, with the question mark underscoring her uncertainty. In it, she wrote not just about her growing relationship with the Mitchells, but about her own internal excavation, the strange dreams, unexpected preferences, and emotional responses that suggested Sarah Mitchell might not be entirely lost after all. November brought crisp winds to Nevada, and the first invitation for Linda to visit Maine. The email from Janet was careful and considerate, suggesting a neutral meeting place, a vacation rental on the coast, away from the emotional weight of their home and Walden's collective memory of Sarah's disappearance. "We understand if it's too soon," Janet wrote. "There's no pressure, and we can continue with video calls as long as you need." Agent Delgado called the next day with news that the FBI would cover her travel expenses as part of the ongoing investigation into the Winters and potential accomplices. Rita had already coordinated with a colleague in Portland who specialized in trauma-informed family reunification. Everything was arranged, waiting only for Linda's decision. She stood in her bedroom, staring at an open suitcase on her bed. Her carefully ordered life had no precedent for this journey into an identity she didn't remember and a family she didn't know. She picked up the red mittens, now kept together in a small shadow box on her dresser, and felt their weight in her hands, wondering if the girl who had worn them would want her to go. The decision came not from certainty, but from a growing sense that staying in place was no longer an option. Linda had already requested a leave of absence from the college, explaining her situation to Dr. Patel, who had responded with compassionate support and an offer to connect her with trauma specialists upon her return. "This is incredibly brave," Dr. Patel had told her, squeezing her hand. "Whatever you discover, you're still you." Linda methodically prepared her apartment for a month-long absence, setting up automatic payments for bills and arranging for a colleague to water her few plants. The night before her departure, she received a package from Janet, a down jacket in deep plum, with a note explaining that Nevada clothing wouldn't be warm enough for a Maine December. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the maternal foresight it represented, brought unexpected tears. Linda packed the jacket, along with the small album of Mitchell family photos she'd been sent, and the journal where she documented her fragmentary connections to Sarah. The transcontinental flight gave Linda 5 hours of suspended animation between her established life and the uncertain future awaiting her. She watched Nevada's desert landscape recede beneath her, then disappear entirely as the plane rose above a layer of clouds. Beside her sat Rita, who had arranged to accompany her for the first week of the visit, providing professional support during the critical initial interactions. They reviewed the plan that had been developed with input from both Linda and the Mitchells. First, a dinner at the rental house with just Janet and Tom. Then, gradual introductions to Jason's family and selected close friends over subsequent days. There would be no pressure to visit Walden immediately, no expectation of recovered memories, and no public announcements until Linda felt ready. "This is your journey, at your pace," Rita reminded her. "You don't owe anyone a specific outcome." The Portland airport buzzed with holiday travelers, but Linda spotted Janet and Tom immediately. They stood slightly apart from the crowd, Janet clutching a small welcome sign with Linda written in careful script, Tom's arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. The four adults navigated the first moments of greeting with awkward half-hugs and careful smiles, loading luggage into Tom's SUV in a silence broken only by comments about the weather and Linda's flight. As they drove toward the coastal town where they'd rented the house, the landscape transformed into dense forests of bare trees and occasional glimpses of steel-gray ocean. Linda pressed her forehead against the cold window glass, absorbing the unfamiliar terrain that had once been her home. When the first snowflakes began to fall, swirling against the darkening sky, she felt a sudden, visceral thrill that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious memory. The rental house sat on a bluff overlooking a small bay, its large windows framing the dramatic coastline and the snow that was now falling steadily. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the kitchen counter held a spread of local foods, Maine cheeses, apple cider, blueberry preserves, and freshly baked bread. Janet had clearly put thought into creating a welcoming but unpressured environment, with separate bedrooms arranged for privacy and a living room spacious enough for comfortable distance. After a simple dinner, during which conversation focused mainly on the present, Linda's flight, the rental house, plans for the following day, Janet hesitantly brought out a small, worn book. "This was your favorite," she said, offering it to Linda. "You made us read it every night for months." Linda accepted the children's book, Blueberries for Sal, its cover showing a young girl collecting berries on a Maine hillside. As she opened it, a pressed blueberry leaf fell out, preserved between the pages for over 20 years. And with it came the first clear sensory memory, the sweet tart taste of wild berries and the feeling of small fingers stained purple with juice. The days at the coastal rental house fell into a gentle rhythm as December deepened around them. Each morning, Linda woke early and took solitary walks along the shoreline, bundled in the plum jacket Janet had given her. The cold air felt foreign, yet strangely right against her skin. Like a forgotten language her body still somehow understood. She collected smooth stones and pieces of sea glass, arranging them on her windowsill in patterns that satisfied some unconscious aesthetic. When Janet noticed the collection, she smiled with quiet recognition. "You used to do that as a little girl," she said. "Line up treasures on your windowsill. You had a system, by color, then by size." The comment startled Linda. These unconscious habits, the way she organized objects, her preference for the left side of the bed, her dislike of green peppers, had always seemed random. Now she wondered how many were echoes from before, remnants of Sarah that had survived the winter's systematic erasure. Afternoons were spent in longer conversations with Janet and Tom, gradually moving from safe topics to more personal histories. They shared stories of Sarah's childhood, her fascination with tide pools, her collection of unusual rocks, her determination to learn to whistle, without expectation that the stories would trigger recognition. Instead, they offered them as gifts, pieces of a puzzle Linda could examine and set aside, or incorporate as she chose. Evenings often found them sharing meals prepared together, the kitchen becoming neutral territory, where Linda could both observe and participate in family dynamics without pressure. On the fifth day, Jason arrived with his wife Meredith and their daughter Emma. The 7-year-old approached Linda with the directness unique to children, presenting her with a hand-drawn family tree that included a branch labeled Aunts Linda Sarah with a question mark. "Mom said you don't remember being little with Dad," Emma explained, "so I made this to help you." The simple gesture broke through formalities that the adults had carefully maintained. Linda knelt to Emma's level, genuinely touched by the child's attempt to make sense of their complicated connection. "Thank you," she said. "This helps a lot." Jason watched the interaction with visible emotion. Later, when Emma was occupied with a movie, he confided to Linda how his daughter's birth had intensified his grief over Sarah's absence. "When Emma was born, it hit me that she would never know her aunt," he said, his voice low. "Our family history would always be incomplete." He looked over at Emma, now curled up with Janet, watching a cartoon. "Now, seeing you two together, it feels like a circle closing somehow. Not the same way it would have been, but meaningful all the same." The first visit to Walden came in the second week, a brief drive-through with Agent Delgado accompanying them in an unmarked car. The town had been notified through official channels about Sarah's recovery, but details had been kept confidential to protect Linda's privacy during this transition period. Snow covered the New England village in picturesque white, transforming the main street with its small shops and municipal buildings into a scene from a holiday card. Tom drove slowly past landmarks, the elementary school, where Sarah had attended through 3rd grade, the community center where she'd taken ballet lessons, the park where she'd learned to ice skate. Linda watched through the window, searching for any flicker of recognition, feeling both disconnected from and eerily familiar with these spaces. At the town square, they paused briefly to view Sarah's memorial tree, now 20 feet tall, its branches heavy with snow, and a simple wreath at its base. Linda didn't ask to get out of the car, not yet ready to confront the physical monument to her own disappearance. That night, Linda experienced the first of what would become recurring dreams, vivid, sensory fragments that felt more like recovered memories than typical dreams. She was walking through deep snow, small legs working hard to push through drifts, red mittens bright against the white landscape. There was anticipation in her chest, excitement about reaching a destination just ahead. She could hear a voice calling a name, her name, but it was muffled by the snow-dampened air. She turned toward it, recognizing the voice as someone she loved, feeling safe. But between one step and the next, the snow-covered path became the dusty gravel of the Winter Ranch, and the voice calling her changed to Martha Winter's sharp tone, demanding she come inside immediately. Linda woke disoriented, the dream so tactile she could almost feel snow melting on her face. She recorded it immediately in her journal, noting not just the imagery, but the emotional transition from security to constraint, wondering if she had captured an actual moment of transition between Sarah and Linda. Rita's professional support proved invaluable as these memory fragments emerged with increasing frequency. She explained how trauma could compartmentalize memories, especially in young children, and how environmental triggers might now be releasing them. "The brain protects itself," she told Linda during one of their sessions at the rental house. "When you were taken, it may have been easier to block Sarah entirely than to integrate what happened." She helped Linda develop techniques to sit with these emerging fragments without forcing them to form a coherent narrative prematurely. Together, they created a timeline on a large piece of paper, marking known events from both lives, Sarah's documented activities in Walden, Linda's reconstructed history with the Winters, with space between for the missing years and blank spots where memories might eventually be placed. This visual representation of her bifurcated life helped Linda begin to conceptualize herself not as two separate people, but as one continuous person whose path had been violently diverted, but might now be understood in its entirety. As Christmas approached, Linda found herself caught between two worlds: the quiet, isolated holidays she had spent with the Winters and later alone, and the vibrant family traditions the Mitchells were carefully introducing. This in-between state felt symbolic of her entire situation. neither fully Linda nor fully Sarah, existing in a liminal space between identities. Agent Delgado arrived at the rental house on December 23rd, her expression indicating this wasn't merely a social visit. Linda recognized the look. She had seen it when Delgado first explained the DNA results, a blend of professional detachment and genuine concern. "We've made progress on the investigation," Delgado said, once they were settled in the living room. Janet and Tom sitting close together on the couch, Linda in an armchair by the window. The FBI obtained a warrant to search the Winter Ranch thoroughly. In a locked shed behind the main house, we found some significant items. She opened a folder on the coffee table, revealing photographs of documents, property records for 5 different residences across 4 states, financial statements showing regular cash deposits from unknown sources, and multiple sets of identification documents for Gerald and Martha under various names. The Winters weren't who they claimed to be, Delgado continued. We're still untangling their actual identities and movements. Linda felt a strange detachment as she studied the evidence of the Winters' deception. Who were these people who had raised her? Had anything they told her been true? "There's something else," Delgado said, hesitating slightly. "We found a hidden compartment containing a VHS tape labeled simply SM 1996. It might contain footage of you shortly after your abduction." The room went silent. Linda could hear the soft hiss of snow against the windows and Janet's quick intake of breath. "The tape is being processed by our lab," Delgado continued. "I know this is difficult, but would you be willing to view it once it's ready? It might provide information about the Winters' motives and possible accomplices." Linda stared out at the snow-covered landscape, considering the request. Since discovering her true identity, she had been haunted by questions about the Winters. Why had they taken her specifically? What had motivated them to maintain the deception for so long? Gerald Winter had been stern, but not overtly cruel. Martha strict and distant, but not abusive in conventional ways. They had provided adequate care, food, shelter, education, while systematically isolating her from meaningful connections. Their deaths had left Linda with mixed feelings of loss and relief, but never suspicion. Now, faced with evidence of their calculated deception, she struggled to reconcile her lived experience with the emerging truth of their criminality. "I'll watch it," she said finally. "I need to understand." The holiday itself brought unexpected solace as Linda was incorporated into Mitchell family traditions with sensitivity and warmth. Janet had asked in advance which customs Linda had grown up with, carefully integrating elements of both worlds. The cinnamon rolls Linda associated with Christmas morning, alongside the traditional New England oyster stew the Mitchells had always shared on Christmas Eve. Presents were exchanged with thoughtful restraint, each gift chosen to acknowledge both who Linda was now and the connection they hoped to nurture. From Janet, a hand-knitted scarf in colors that complemented the plum jacket. From Tom, a first edition of a novel Linda had mentioned loving. From Jason and his family, a photo album with current pictures of their shared outings, the first pages of a new history they were creating together. Linda had worried about having nothing to give in return, but Rita had helped her select meaningful items. Local Nevada honey for Janet, a book on desert ecology for Tom, and for Emma, a collection of polished stones from the Nevada landscape connecting their different worlds. Between Christmas and New Year's, the FBI arranged a secure viewing of the VHS tape at their Portland field office. Linda sat between Rita and Agent Delgado, Janet and Tom waiting in an adjacent room by mutual agreement, present for support, but giving Linda space to process the content privately first. The footage, grainy and amateur, showed a small girl sitting at a kitchen table in an unfamiliar house, coloring with crayons. Her hair, once in neat braids in the school photos Linda had seen, had been roughly cut into a short, uneven style. She wore clothes too large for her frame, a boy's flannel shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Martha Winter's voice came from behind the camera. "Tell us your name, sweetheart." The girl looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. "Sarah," she said quietly, then glanced fearfully to someone off-camera. Martha's voice again, with an edge of forced patience. "No, remember what we practiced. Your new name." A long pause, then barely audible. "Linda." Gerald Winter's voice from off-screen. "And how old are you, Linda?" Another hesitation. 9. "And what happened to your parents?" "They died in a car crash." The mechanical recitation continued. The girl, Sarah becoming Linda, repeating a fabricated history under clear duress, her eyes occasionally darting off camera where Gerald presumably stood. Linda watched herself being systematically reprogrammed, her identity methodically erased and replaced, and felt a surge of grief and rage so powerful it momentarily took her breath away. The tape continued for nearly 40 minutes, documenting several similar sessions over what appeared to be a span of weeks or months, the girl gradually responding more readily to Linda, the fabricated history becoming more fluent in her telling. Agent Delgado stopped the playback when Linda requested, visibly shaken by witnessing her own psychological conditioning. In a gentle debriefing afterward, Delgado shared their current theory. The Winters had been part of a small doomsday cult that had dissolved in the early 1990s. Former members interviewed by the FBI described the group's belief that they needed to save children from the coming apocalypse by removing them from biological families deemed spiritually impure. While no direct connection had yet been established between the cult and Sarah's abduction specifically, the methodology shown in the video aligned with known cult practices of identity erasure and replacement. This potential motive, however twisted, offered Linda the first framework for understanding why she had been taken, why the Winters had moved so frequently, and why they had isolated her so completely. It wasn't personal. She hadn't been targeted for who she was, but for what she represented in a delusional worldview. The realization brought no comfort, but it began to fill the explanatory void that had haunted her. January brought a legal milestone in Linda's journey, the filing of paperwork to reclaim her birth name and identity. The process involved multiple hearings, affidavits from the FBI and medical experts, and DNA certification. She had deliberated extensively with Rita about whether this official reclamation aligned with her internal experience. She still thought of herself primarily as Linda, still started slightly when the Mitchells called her Sarah, still signed her name with the fluid L she'd practiced through adolescence. But practically, reclaiming her birth identity would resolve numerous legal complications, from inheritance rights to passports, Social Security benefits to medical records. More significantly, it represented a concrete step toward integrating her bifurcated life, acknowledging both her origin and the path that had diverged from it. At the courthouse in Portland, Janet and Tom sat behind her as the judge formally restored her birth name, declaring Linda Grant a legally fictitious identity created through criminal action. Sarah accepted the court documents with a strange sense of having won a victory for someone else. The 9-year-old girl whose existence had been legally erased was now restored in the eyes of the law, even if that girl remained partially a stranger to the woman who now carried her name. "How does it feel?" Rita asked as they left the courthouse, snow falling gently around them. "Surreal," Sarah replied, testing the word in her mind. Sarah Mitchell. "Like I've been given someone else's name tag at a conference." Rita smiled with understanding. "Identity is much more than a legal designation. The paperwork is just one piece of a much larger process." With her legal identity resolved, Sarah, she was practicing thinking of herself by this name, testing it like a new garment for fit, faced the question of where and how to live moving forward. The Mitchells had made it clear she was welcome to stay with them in Walden indefinitely, but had been careful not to pressure her. Her leave from the community college in Nevada had been extended through the spring semester, and her apartment lease would expire in March, creating a natural decision point. After much reflection, Sarah proposed a compromise that honored both her need for independence and her desire to explore her newfound family connections. She would return to Nevada temporarily to settle her affairs, then move to Portland, Maine, close enough to the Mitchells for regular visits, but with sufficient distance to establish her own life in this reclaimed identity. Janet had cried with a mixture of understanding and gratitude when Sarah shared this plan, recognizing it as a significant commitment to their ongoing relationship. Tom had immediately begun researching apartment options in Portland's Arts District, an area he thought might appeal to Sarah's aesthetic sensibilities, while Jason offered connections to the community college system where he taught engineering courses. Before returning to Nevada, Sarah requested a visit to the Walden Elementary School, now ready to confront a location central to both her disappearance and her early life. Agent Delgado arranged for the visit during a teacher workday when students were absent, accompanied by the school principal who had been there when Sarah disappeared. Now near retirement, but with vivid memories of the community trauma that followed. The building had been renovated several times in the intervening decades, but the basic layout remained unchanged. Sarah walked the hallways, peering into classrooms with their miniature chairs and primary-colored decorations, trying to connect with the child who had once belonged in these spaces. In the third-grade classroom, where she would have been a student, she paused by a particular desk near the window, drawn to it without conscious thought. The principal noticed and commented softly, "That was where you sat. We kept your desk empty for the rest of that year." The coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence, of her instinctive gravitation to that specific spot among many identical desks sent a chill through Sarah. It suggested a level of physical memory that transcended her conscious recall, as if her body remembered spaces her mind had sealed away. The return to Nevada in early February felt like entering a familiar dream with new awareness of its artifice. Sarah's apartment, with its careful organization and minimal personalization, now seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a way station. A place she had never fully inhabited because some part of her had always known it wasn't truly hers to claim. She methodically sorted through her possessions, separating them into categories: items to bring to Maine, those to donate, and a small collection of objects connected to the Winters that she wasn't yet ready to discard but couldn't imagine displaying in her new life. Among the latter was a photo of Martha Winter standing stiffly beside teenage Linda at a state homeschooling conference, the closest thing to affection the woman had ever displayed publicly. Sarah studied the image, searching for signs of the deception now revealed, wondering if some part of her had always sensed the wrongness beneath the surface of their relationship. She recognized now the constant low-grade anxiety she'd lived with in the Winters' home. Not fear of physical harm, but a deep insecurity about her place and identity, as if some cellular memory had maintained awareness of the rupture, even when her conscious mind could not. Her final week in Nevada included a carefully orchestrated visit to the Winter Ranch, facilitated by Agent Delgado to ensure both safety and potential evidentiary value. The property had stood vacant since Martha's death, the house now weather-beaten, and the surrounding land reclaimed by desert growth. Sarah walked through rooms that felt simultaneously intimate and foreign. The kitchen, where she had learned to bake bread from Martha's exacting instructions. The small bedroom, where she had spent countless hours with books as her primary companions. The living room, where Gerald had read aloud from apocalyptic religious texts every evening before dinner. In the shed, where the VHS tape had been discovered, Sarah experienced her most vivid recovered memory yet. Herself as a young girl, perhaps 11 or 12, secretly listening at the shed door as the Winters argued about whether it was time for another move. Martha's voice had been insistent. Someone was asking questions at the market, while Gerald had dismissed her concerns as paranoia. The fragment was brief but crystal clear, carrying with it the child's rising terror at the prospect of another upheaval, another school removed, another set of potential connections severed. Standing now in that same space as an adult, Sarah felt a surge of protective rage toward that frightened child, a fierce, retrospective desire to shield her younger self from the isolation that had been systematically imposed by her captors in the name of salvation. Sarah's return to Maine in late February coincided with the FBI's public announcement of her recovery, a carefully worded press release that confirmed the resolution of a 20-year-old missing persons case without divulging personal details. Despite these precautions, the story captured national media attention almost immediately. The photogenic child gone missing from a small town, the decades of false leads and heartbreak, the improbable discovery through a DMV clerical check, all combined to create an irresistible human interest narrative. Within days, reporters descended on Walden, camping outside the Mitchell home and approaching anyone who might have known Sarah before her disappearance. The quiet reintegration Sarah had envisioned was quickly overtaken by a barrage of interview requests, television news vans parked on street corners, and tabloid headlines speculating about her life with the Winters. "This wasn't part of the plan," Sarah said, staring out the window of her new Portland apartment at a reporter attempting to look inconspicuous across the street. Agent Delgado had arranged for temporary security measures and media management, but the intensity of public curiosity created a new layer of pressure just as Sarah was attempting to establish her life in Maine. "People have been wondering what happened to you for 20 years, Rita reminded her gently. "It's natural they want to know you're okay." "But they don't want to know if I'm okay," Sarah said. "They want a story, preferably one with dramatic suffering and a happy ending. They want to package 20 years of my life into a 10-minute segment between commercials." The media coverage, while overwhelming, had an unexpected consequence. It flushed out information that might otherwise have remained buried. A woman in Wyoming contacted the FBI after seeing Sarah's story on the news, reporting that the Winters had lived next door to her family for several years in the early 2000s under the names Gerald and Martha Bishop. She remembered their quiet niece, Lisa, who was rarely allowed to play with other children, but had once confided to the woman's daughter that she had dreams about a different house with a big pine tree in the yard. Most significantly, an elderly man from the disbanded religious group the Winters had belonged to provided context for their actions, explaining that Gerald had become fixated on a prophecy about saving children born in specific years, believing they possessed spiritual significance for the coming apocalypse. Sarah's birth year, 1986, had been one of those designated as chosen, potentially explaining why she had been targeted despite no personal connection to the Winters. This flood of new information created both clarity and complication in Sarah's ongoing therapy. The additional puzzle pieces helped construct a more complete picture of what had happened to her, validating her fragmented memories and providing context for the Winters' methods of control. But each new revelation also reopened wounds just beginning to heal, forcing her to repeatedly process and integrate additional aspects of her trauma. Rita Hang and her Portland colleague Dr. Brennan developed a specialized approach combining narrative therapy with EMDR techniques, helping Sarah create a coherent timeline of her life that acknowledged both continuity and rupture. Central to this process was the recognition that she was neither fully Linda nor fully Sarah, but rather someone uniquely formed by both experiences, the resilient child who had survived by adapting to her captor's demands, and the cautious adult who had built a life within the constraints of that adaptation. This integrated identity began to feel less like a fragmentation and more like a complex wholeness, a unique perspective forged through extraordinary circumstances. The pressure of public attention reached its peak when a national morning show aired a special report on Sarah's case, featuring interviews with the Mitchells, Agent Delgado, and several Walden residents who had participated in the original search. The program included age progression photos of Sarah, alongside current images captured by paparazzi as she entered her Portland apartment building, creating a before, during, after narrative that felt invasively reductive. Sarah watched the broadcast alone in her apartment, cringing at the simplified timeline that compressed 20 years of lived experience into a 7-minute segment punctuated by commercial breaks. The show concluded with speculation about her current life and emotional state, experts weighing in on her potential psychological challenges without ever having met her. The host ended with a direct appeal. "Sarah Mitchell, if you're watching, we'd love to have you tell your story in your own words." The presumption that her trauma was public property, a story to be consumed alongside breakfast, left Sarah feeling simultaneously exposed and erased, her complex reality flattened into entertainment. "I hate this," she told Rita during their next session. "I feel like I'm being pushed to perform a role in someone else's narrative about me." "You have choices," Rita reminded her. "You can continue to maintain your privacy, or you can choose to engage on your terms. Either way, the media frenzy will eventually die down." In response to the media circus, Sarah made a difficult decision. She would give one single interview to a journalist known for sensitive coverage of trauma survivors, with strict conditions about what could be discussed and how the story would be framed. This controlled narrative would serve both as a public statement, potentially reducing the frenzy of speculation, and as a reclamation of her story on her own terms. Working with Rita and Agent Delgado, she selected Rebecca Liang from the Boston Globe, a reporter whose previous work on child trafficking had demonstrated unusual depth and respect for survivors' dignity. The interview was conducted over 2 days in a neutral location, with breaks whenever Sarah needed them and veto power over any content she felt uncomfortable sharing. Rather than focusing on sensationalistic details of her captivity, Sarah directed the conversation toward recovery and integration, how she was navigating her dual identity, reconnecting with her family, and advocating for improved systems to identify missing children. When asked what she would want people to understand about her experience, Sarah replied with careful consideration that identity isn't just what happens to you, but what you build from it. "I'm not just a former missing child or a kidnapping victim. I'm someone who lived 2 lives and is now creating a third that honors both." Spring in Maine brought a physical rebirth that paralleled Sarah's internal journey of integration. Her Portland apartment, initially sparse and functional like her Nevada home, gradually accumulated personal touches that reflected both her past and emerging self. Photographs of the Mitchells sat alongside carefully selected items from her Linda years on bookshelves and side tables. Books from both phases of her life shared shelf space, their spines forming a visual timeline of her divided history. New acquisitions represented her current tastes and interests. A pottery wheel after she discovered an unexpected affinity for working with clay. Local artwork featuring Maine landscapes that resonated with her on levels she was still exploring. Hiking boots for weekend excursions with Jason and his family. The space became a physical manifestation of her ongoing integration, neither erasing Linda nor fully embracing a Sarah she couldn't completely remember, but creating something uniquely her own. She had enrolled in a psychology course at the local community college, her academic curiosity sparked by her own experience with memory and trauma. The professor, unaware of her history, had recommended her for a research position based on her insightful questions and careful analysis. Sarah politely declined, not ready to immerse herself in academic study of what she was still living through, but tucked the possibility away for the future, a potential path forward when she felt more settled. Weekends often found her in Walden with her family, slowly building relationships that acknowledged both their shared history and the decades of separation. These visits required careful navigation of complex emotions, Janet's occasional slips into treating her as the 9-year-old she had lost, Tom's overprotectiveness, Jason's alternating distance and intensity. but each interaction added another thread to the fabric of connection they were collectively weaving. "You don't have to come every weekend," Janet assured her one Sunday as they prepared dinner together. "I know it's a lot." Sarah smiled, recognizing the careful way her mother avoided applying pressure while simultaneously making sure Sarah knew she was wanted. "I like coming," she replied simply. "It helps me understand who I was, who I might have been." The psychological work continued to be challenging and often painful. Under Dr. Brennan's guidance, Sarah began to address not just the trauma of her abduction, but the compound trauma of her recovery. The disorientation of having her established identity revealed as a construction, the guilt over grieving the Winters, despite their crimes against her, the pressure of others' expectations about who Sarah should be. In one particularly difficult session, she articulated a fear that had been growing since her return to Maine. "What if I can never be the Sarah they lost? What if Linda is too much a part of me now?" Dr. Brennan had helped her reframe this concern, suggesting that the Mitchells hadn't been frozen in time either. They had continued to evolve through their grief, becoming different people than they would have been if Sarah had never disappeared. "The family's task isn't to recapture what was lost," he explained, "but to create something new that honors all you've experienced in the intervening years." This perspective opened space for Sarah to be authentic rather than performative in her family interactions, reducing the pressure to fulfill a role she couldn't fully remember or embody. As her comfort with her reclaimed identity grew, Sarah began to contemplate more public engagement with her experience, motivated by a desire to improve systems for other missing children and their families. Agent Delgado connected her with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where she consulted on improvements to the database system that had matched her case through the DMV discrepancy. She recorded a short video for law enforcement training, explaining how the Winters' isolation tactics had prevented her from seeking help even as she grew older, emphasizing the need for alert systems that could identify potential abduction situations through unusual patterns rather than individual reports. These limited professional engagements allowed her to transform her trauma into constructive action without exposing herself to the voyeuristic public interest that still occasionally flared when new details of the case emerged. The work also connected her with other recovered missing persons, creating a small community of individuals who uniquely understood the complex process of reclaiming an interrupted life. A monthly online support group became a valuable resource, a space where Sarah could speak openly about the surreal experience of learning your entire history had been fabricated. The disorienting task of connecting with family who knew you better than you knew yourself. The strange grief for a life you couldn't remember losing. In late April, a final piece of the investigation fell into place when the FBI located and interviewed a woman named Clara Winters, Gerald's estranged sister. Clara revealed that Gerald and Martha had been unable to have children of their own. Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages before a hysterectomy in her 30s, and their grief had become intertwined with the apocalyptic beliefs of their religious group. Gerald had become convinced that adopting through legal channels would be insufficient for their divine purpose of raising chosen children for the coming new world. Clara had severed contact with her brother after he began discussing rescuing children from doomed families, reporting her concerns to local police, who had dismissed them as a family dispute without criminal elements. Her testimony provided the final confirmation of the Winters' motives. Closing the investigative file that had remained open for over 20 years, Agent Delgado brought this information to Sarah personally, offering it as the last missing puzzle piece in understanding the twisted logic that had altered the course of her life. While the explanation could never justify what had been done to her, it completed the narrative in a way that allowed Sarah to place the Winters in a comprehensible context rather than leaving them as incomprehensible monsters in her history. The most profound moment of Sarah's ongoing integration came unexpectedly during a routine visit to Walden. She had been helping Janet sort through old family photographs for a digitization project, the two of them sitting at the kitchen table with boxes of albums spread between them. Sarah came across a school picture of herself at 7, wearing a green dress with white collar, her hair in the neat braids that had been her daily style. She studied the image, feeling the familiar disconnect between recognizing her own features and having no memory of the moment captured. Then Janet began to laugh softly, pointing to the girl's expression. "You always made that face when you were pretending to be patient, but really wanted to be anywhere else. You hated picture day, said the photographer took too long, and the collar itched." As she spoke, Sarah suddenly recalled the sensation with perfect clarity. The scratchy fabric against her neck, the photographer's repeated instructions to smile naturally while holding perfectly still, the mental counting of seconds until she could change back into her comfortable clothes. It wasn't a dramatic memory of her abduction or a critical life event, just an ordinary childhood irritation, but it was undeniably hers, a genuine fragment of Sarah's experience that had survived the winter's systematic erasure. She looked up at Janet with tears in her eyes, not needing to explain the significance of the moment. Her mother nodded in understanding, reaching across the photographs to squeeze her hand, a bridge across time connecting the girl in the green dress to the woman she had become. October 12, 2017 marked 22 years since Sarah's disappearance and 2 years since her rediscovery. The date had always been commemorated in Walden, with a small ceremony at the memorial tree. But this year would be different. Sarah would attend for the first time, and the gathering would transform from a memorial to a celebration of recovery and resilience. In the weeks leading up to the event, Sarah worked closely with Rita, who had remained a valued counselor even after her official role ended, and the Mitchells, to prepare emotionally for this public milestone. The ceremony would include the removal of the dates from the bronze plaque at the tree's base, replacing them with a new inscription acknowledging both the loss and the return. Sarah had been asked to speak briefly if she felt comfortable, an opportunity she approached with both trepidation and a sense of necessary closure. She wrote and rewrote her remarks, trying to find language that could express the inexplicable journey from Sarah to Linda and back to a new integration of both. "You don't have to do this," Tom reminded her during a phone call the week before. "No one expects you to perform for the town." "I know," Sarah replied, "but I think I need to do it for myself, to stand in that place not as a memory or a ghost, but as a real person." The day dawned clear and cold, the Maine autumn at its peak with forests blazing in red and gold around the small town. Sarah dressed carefully in her Portland apartment, a deep blue dress with a cardigan that echoed her last school photo but in an adult style, and around her neck, a silver pendant Janet had given her for her 31st birthday, engraved with intertwined initials, S and L. As she drove the familiar route to Walden, now navigable without directions after months of regular visits, she reflected on how much had changed since her first tentative return to Maine. The nightmares had diminished in frequency, though they still came occasionally. The disorienting moments of identity confusion had become rare. The relationships with her family had deepened beyond the initial cautious reconnection into genuine, if sometimes complicated, bonds of love and shared history. Most significantly, she had begun to think of herself as simply Sarah, not the child Sarah who had disappeared, or the artificial Linda constructed by the Winters, but the woman who had integrated both experiences into a coherent, if unusual, life narrative. The town square was filled when Sarah arrived, not just with the expected residents and officials, but with people who had traveled from across the country to witness this rare moment of resolution in a story that had captured national attention over 2 decades. Former search volunteers, now gray-haired, stood alongside young parents who had been children themselves when Sarah disappeared. Agent Delgado was there, representing the FBI team that had helped solve the case, as was Marcus Wong, the DMV intern whose attention to detail had initiated the chain of discovery. Rita Hang stood near the podium with Dr. Brennan, their professional satisfaction in Sarah's progress evident in their proud expressions. Most importantly, the Mitchells waited for her near the memorial tree, Janet and Tom holding hands, Jason with his arm around Meredith, and Emma, now 9 herself, fidgeting in a dress clearly chosen for the important occasion. They had become Sarah's emotional anchor in the storm of recovery, their patient acceptance of who she was now rather than who she might have been, creating space for her to rebuild her sense of belonging. The ceremony itself was brief but powerful. The town mayor spoke about the community's enduring commitment to the Mitchell family throughout their long ordeal, acknowledging that Sarah's return represented hope for other families still waiting. Tom, speaking on behalf of the family, thanked the town for 2 decades of support and for celebrating with them now, his voice breaking only once when he mentioned the day Janet had received the call from Agent Delgado. The unveiling of the new plaque was conducted by Emma, who solemnly removed the cloth to reveal the updated inscription, "Sarah Mitchell, lost and found, a reminder that hope endures." When Sarah stepped to the podium, a hush fell over the gathering. She looked out at the faces, some familiar now, others still strangers, and began to speak, her voice steady and clear in the crisp autumn air. 22 years ago, a little girl wearing red mittens disappeared between her home and her school. For 2 decades, you kept her memory alive while she was living another life as someone else. Today, I stand before you as both that lost child and the woman she became. Not fully one or the other, but someone shaped by an extraordinary journey between 2 lives. She continued, keeping the remarks brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the community that had never forgotten Sarah, even when she couldn't remember herself. Your constancy created a place for me to return to, even though I didn't know I was lost. For that gift, I will always be grateful. After the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah remained in the square for over an hour, accepting embraces from former teachers who had kept her desk empty, neighbors who had searched the woods calling her name, and parents of childhood friends who had never forgotten the little girl with the red mittens. One elderly woman approached, leaning heavily on a cane, introducing herself as Mrs. Gagnon, Sarah's 3rd-grade teacher. "I kept this all these years," she said, pressing a small paper into Sarah's hand. "I always hoped I might be able to return it to you someday." Sarah looked down at a slightly yellowed drawing of a pine tree with a small figure in a red coat standing beneath it, signed in childish script, Sarah M., Grade 3. The simple artwork, preserved by a teacher who had refused to give up hope, affected Sarah more deeply than any of the formal speeches or ceremonies. It represented not just what had been lost, but the threads of connection that had remained intact despite everything that had happened. The community that had held space for her return, the family that had never stopped loving her, and her own resilient spirit that had survived the rupture of her childhood to create a life worth living in its aftermath. That evening, after the public events concluded, the Mitchell family gathered at Janet and Tom's home for a private dinner. The conversation flowed naturally between past and present, memories of Sarah's childhood interspersed with plans for the coming holiday season, and gentle teasing between siblings who were still learning each other's adult personalities. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Janet brought out a small music box, the one that played the lullaby Sarah had recognized from her dreams. "I used to play this every night after you disappeared," she said softly. "I thought somehow you might hear it, wherever you were." Sarah took the delicate wooden box, opening it to release the familiar melody into the warm kitchen. The tune connected her to both her earliest memories as Sarah and the mysterious dreams she'd had as Linda, a musical thread that had survived the winter's systematic erasure of her identity. She closed her eyes, allowing the melody to wash over her, feeling for perhaps the first time the complete integration of her fractured past into a coherent whole. She was Sarah Mitchell, who had also been Linda Grant and was now simply herself, a woman who had traveled an unimaginable path home. 1 year after the memorial ceremony, Sarah Mitchell stood in her office at the Family Reunification Center of New England, surrounded by case files and the gentle autumn light streaming through windows that overlooked Portland's harbor. At 32, she had found unexpected purpose in her unique perspective, completing accelerated training in trauma-informed counseling and joining the center as a specialist in cases involving long-term separation and identity disruption. Her dual experience as both a recovered missing child and an adult who had lived a constructed life made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between law enforcement, psychological services, and affected families. The center, partially funded by a grant Agent Delgado had helped secure, worked with cases ranging from family abductions to trafficking survivors, focusing on the complex reintegration process that official recovery protocols often overlooked. Sarah's office reflected her integrated identity, professional credentials displayed alongside a shadow box containing the paired red mittens, photographs of both her current family connections and selected memories from her Linda years, and a small potted white pine grown from a seedling of the memorial tree. The space felt simultaneously professional and deeply personal, a physical representation of the wholeness she had worked so hard to achieve. "Sarah?" Her assistant poked her head through the doorway. "Your 2 o'clock is here. The Rodriguez case." Sarah nodded, closing the file she'd been reviewing. "Send them in, please." Her personal life had settled into a rhythm that balanced independence with connection. She maintained her Portland apartment as her primary residence, valuing the space to process her continuing emotional work without the pressure of constant family presence. Weekends often found her in Walden, now comfortable enough in the Mitchell home to have her own routines. Sunday morning runs along the lake path, afternoons helping Tom in his bookstore, evenings playing board games with Jason's family, who had welcomed their second child the previous spring. Her relationship with Janet had evolved into a deep adult friendship that honored but wasn't limited by their mother-daughter connection, each woman recognizing the other's strength and respecting the separate journeys they had traveled to reach this point of reconnection. Sarah had even cautiously begun dating, recently meeting a marine biologist named David through her volunteer work with a coastal conservation project. Their relationship was proceeding with the careful deliberation that characterized most of Sarah's important decisions, but his patient understanding of her complex history and his own experience with family disruption created a foundation of unusual empathy. The publication of Rebecca Liang's book about Sarah's case had brought a final wave of public attention, but one managed on Sarah's terms with her full participation. Unlike the sensationalized media coverage that had followed her initial recovery, the book presented a nuanced exploration of identity, memory, and resilience, incorporating not just Sarah's experience, but the perspectives of experts in child development, trauma recovery, and the systemic failures that had allowed her case to remain unsolved for so long. Sarah had contributed a chapter in her own words, describing the ongoing process of integration and healing, without minimizing the challenges or presenting her story as a simple triumph narrative. The book had become an unexpected resource for both professionals working with trauma survivors and families navigating their own complex reunifications. Its success, leading to an educational foundation established in Sarah's name to support improved training for law enforcement and social services in missing children cases. On a personal level, Sarah continued to experience occasional moments of disconnect, dreams that placed her back at the Winter Ranch, brief disorientation when answering to her birth name, emotional reactions to triggers she couldn't always anticipate. But these moments no longer represented crisis points. Instead, they were integrated into her understanding of herself as someone with an extraordinary history requiring ongoing maintenance rather than a broken person needing to be fixed. Dr. Brennan had helped her develop a framework for these experiences, likening them to the physical therapy an accident survivor might continue long after their acute recovery. Your mind was subjected to an extreme trauma, and then years of compensatory adaptation, he had explained. It's normal and healthy to continue strengthening those neural pathways of integration, just as someone might continue exercises to maintain physical rehabilitation. This perspective allowed Sarah to approach her occasional struggles with compassion rather than frustration, recognizing them as expected aspects of her unique journey, rather than failures of recovery. In her work at the center, Sarah had recently been assigned to a case with remarkable parallels to her own. A 14-year-old boy recovered after 5 years with a non-custodial parent who had created an entirely new identity for him. Unlike Sarah, Miguel retained clear memories of his early childhood, but his case presented similar challenges of identity integration and family reconnection. In their sessions, Sarah used her experience judiciously, sharing relevant insights without imposing her narrative on his different circumstances. During a particularly difficult session, where Miguel expressed feeling caught between two worlds, Sarah had shown him the shadow box with her red mittens. Sometimes integration isn't about choosing one identity over another, or even blending them seamlessly, she had told him. It's about holding both experiences as valid parts of your life story, even when they seem contradictory. The boy had studied the mittens thoughtfully before asking if Sarah was glad to have been found. Her answer embodied the complex wisdom she had earned through her journey. I'm grateful to know the truth of who I am and where I came from. That doesn't erase the pain of what happened or make everything suddenly perfect. But there's power in having the complete story, even when parts of it are difficult to bear. On the anniversary evening of the memorial ceremony, Sarah walked alone along the Eastern Promenade Trail as sunset painted the harbor in shades of gold and rose. She had developed a practice of private reflection to balance the public and family commemorations that now marked the significant dates in her recovered life. As she watched boats returning to the harbor for the night, she contemplated the distance she had traveled, not just the physical miles between Nevada and Maine, but the internal journey from fragmentation toward wholeness. She was neither fully the Sarah who had disappeared in red mittens, nor the Linda who had built a careful life within constraints she hadn't understood, but someone more complex and resilient than either could have become alone. The girl who had walked to school that October morning in 1995 could never have imagined the path her life would take. But Sarah liked to think she would recognize something essential in the woman she had become. The core self that had survived the rupture of her abduction and found its way, however circuitously, back to a life of meaning and connection. As darkness fell over the harbor and lights began to shimmer on the water, Sarah turned toward home, carrying both her past and her future with the hard-won grace of someone who had learned that even the most profound loss could, with time and tremendous work, become part of a larger story of recovery.